Neil is going to be our session discussant, and our first hearing today we have from the Information Systems Department at the London School of Economics. Technically the London School of Economics and Political Science, but for marketing purposes, LSE just sounds so much better. We have Erin Chang talking about California privacy. And to follow up, we have people who saw her yesterday. Dina Marshall, my dear colleague from our marketing department, who knows quite a bit about a lot of things. So with that, Sherry, I turn it over to you.
Welcome, everybody. So we're going to talk about my favorite topic today, which is privacy. I'm a privacy lawyer at Sibley. I'm excited to see what all of our presenters have to say about their research and all the things that I trickle down to my clients and I advise them about. So I think we'll just jump in because time is tight. So turn it over. Probably introduce yourselves and
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Chang from London School of Economics. So today I'm really happy to present our working paper on privacy regulation and AI innovation, responsible AI innovation. So thanks for the organizers to including this paper in this program. I think the audience and also the location are perfect for this research because it is about California Consumer Privacy Act. So over the recent decades, AI as a general purpose technology has attracted significant attention and investment from firms, investors, and government, and is viewed as the key engine for economic growth. But the rapid, large-scale AI development has also come with significant data protection risks. Data breaches and security incidents have become more often, triggering widespread public concern over how personal data is collected, processed, and used. So there are two information assurance mechanisms to address these risks. One is regulatory information assurance, which is often initiated by governments to mandate data protection requirements. GDPR and CCPA are prominent examples. The second is institutional information assurance, which includes organizational and industry-driven mechanisms such as privacy policies, cybersecurity practices, or procedural controls. Recent years, we have seen a shift towards embedding information assurance directly into AI infrastructure. So examples like differential privacy and federated learning, so they exemplify this approach. So in our paper, we call them assurance AI innovation. So in the past, so the regulatory and institutional information assurance are studied and practiced in relatively kind of separate silos. So we want to study their independence and build a bridge. So this brings to kind of broader discussion or debate on the relationship between regulation and innovation. So on the one hand, some research argues that regulation suppresses innovation, citing evidence of increased compliance costs and decreased data access, for example, under GDPR. So on the other hand, regulations can reshape the incentives and cost structures, steering innovation towards more responsible technological trajectory or socially beneficial investment. So we argue that innovation in assurance AI may be a potential redirection force. So this, against this backdrop, we want to ask this overarching question: how do firms respond to data protection regulation in their AI innovation strategies? In particular, do firms simply scale back their innovation, or do they redirect it toward more responsible AI capability building? So to engage with this overarching goal, we review the literature on information assurance and regulation innovation relationships. So in the information systems literature, the institutional information assurance focuses on individuals. For example, the user responses to privacy policies of a company, or employee compliance with particular data governance or cybersecurity law internally. So the regulatory information assurance literature focuses more on GDPR, emphasizing the compliance and kind of firm financial outcomes, but pay limited attention to innovation outcomes. So there's another stream of literature focusing on the data protection regulations in firm innovation, but providing a mixed evidence. For example, survey and interview studies from Germany find that GDPR reduced innovation and access to training data sets, which is detrimental for startups. But there are other papers document benefits, including the increased demand for compliant products and AI-related acquisitions. So, but such work is emerging. Just in recent years, they are mostly descriptive, using self-reported surveys and also without rigorous identification strategies. So they also not kind of differentiate different types of AI, even not about different types of innovation, not even about AI innovation, nor does such literature focus much about the underlying mechanism of regulatory impact, the temporality, and the regional heterogeneity. So the specific research questions I asked are the following. So do data protection regulation affect AI innovation, particularly the development of assurance AI? So if so, does this regulatory influence exhibit a temporal pattern? And does the regulatory influence exhibit regional heterogeneity between high-tech or low-tech areas? So we studied these research questions in the context of a CCPA, which was passed in June 2018 and enacted in January 2020. CCPA grants primarily kind of customer rights, like right to delete, right to opt out, right to non-discrimination. So because this is a single state regulation in the absence of federal legislation, which it allows for a relatively homogeneous comparison between treatment and control groups. But in terms of the scope of the enforcement, actually a CCPA can extend to firms serving California residents. So with like above the threshold of revenue, customer base, and data related to sales. So we adopt a difference in difference framework to study the changes in AI innovation before and after the CCPA introduction between the CCPA affected and unaffected regions. So the analysis is done at the county quarter level, and the analysis also incorporates the regional and time fixed effect, location-specific time varying covariates such as socioeconomic conditions, new business formation, the R&D activities, as well as COVID measures around that time. So to measure the temporal dynamics, we differentiate 3 periods. So the pre-CCPA period before June 2018, and the transition period between the CCPA passage and CCPA enactment, and the post-CCPA period. So to measure the treatment assignment, we consider both the California firms and also non-California firms operating in California. So using fuzzy matching between the patent and the firm branches data, using obvious data set, we measure kind of California firms as like the full treatment, but the non-California firms receive partial treatment proportional to their business presence in California. So we use the USPTO AI patent data set to measure our dependent variable AI innovation. So this data set covers 8 AI domains, such as NLP, computer vision, or AI hardware. So basically, we match these patents to firms and aggregate it to the county quarter level. So beyond the total AI innovation, we also focus on this assurance AI innovation, as mentioned before. We use this PC classification in the data protection category, complemented by the keyword searches using OECD privacy enhancing technology definitions. So turning to the results, you can see that there's no statistically significant changes in the overall AI innovation, but we see a statistically significant increase in the assurance AI, which suggests maybe the redirection view of regulation exists. So when turning to the temporal patterns, we find there is a decrease in the assurance AI innovation shortly after the CCPA passage, but a rebound and sustained growth after CCPA enactment in the 3-year post treatment period. So integrating these 2 patterns, we call it like J-shaped dynamic. And if you see these event study plots, it's easier to tell. And also we look at the geographical differences by splitting the sample into like 2. One is below the high-tech employment, the median high-tech employment, the other is above. So we find that in low-tech areas, like little changes in AI innovation, but in high-tech regions, firms decrease their AI innovation and increase. So the main effect is primarily driven by this effect. So we did a lot of randomization of robust checks to validate our main result, but I don't want to spend time on that. We also explored the underlying mechanisms by asking 2 questions. First is why firms innovate in assurance AI in terms of their strategic drivers. The second is how do firms innovate in terms of their innovation priorities. So we analyzed the S&P 500 earnings core data using topic modeling. And then we identify 16, basically analyzing the corporate discussions about their strategies related to data protection. So we identify 16 topics which can be grouped into 2 themes. One is regulatory compliance, the other is technology infrastructure. We see that in the shorter term after CCPA passage, there's increase in interest in the discussion of regulatory compliance. But after the CCPA enactment, this compliance discussion fade away, and investments in infrastructures take a more dominant role. So we also look at how do firms innovate, how this assurance AI unfolds. So basically, we look at whether such innovation is incremental or radical without relying much or citing previous patents. We also look at what insurance domains this innovation happens. The third is that we want to investigate whether this innovation happens or concentrated more in personal data intensive technologies. We find that firms focus more on radical assurance AI innovation, targeting these confidentiality and integrity dimensions. They also innovate in a way to safeguard personal data. So to summarize, we find no decline in total AI innovation, but reallocation of AI innovation towards assurance technologies. So this effect follows a J-shaped dynamic, and we see some spatial concentration, which suggests a new generation of digital divide after CCPA. So we contribute to the literature by conceptualizing CCPA as a directional force rather than a binary constraint. So the J-shaped temporality also rejects some of the existing assumptions about linear responses to regression, to regulation. We also see that maybe assurance AI is inherently radical. So for policymakers, so this work highlights the importance to provide a clear guidance and targeted support during transitional periods. And for firms, they need to realize that this is a strategic opportunity to explore building responsible AI infrastructure. So that's the end of my research. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thank
Thank
you.
you.
So I actually don't have slides. I'm getting to the spirit of the whole law school thing. Also, I just didn't have time to make slides, but I do have a few points. So really great paper. I learned a lot. I'm not in the innovation sort of. I do somewhat different work, and I found, it's just a really fascinating idea that you have regulation that you would think might stifle innovation, and instead it pushes people to sort of have these digital protections that, you have new patents coming out that actually assure people that their data will be safe, and at the same time, sort of gives new opportunities to firms. I really appreciated, the identification strategy. I did have some questions on, I do think that sort of the paper can be made a little bit more. Yesterday we talked about can be simplified a little bit to just sort of appeal to a broader audience, not just the innovation audience. So my question had to do with this kind of partial treatment that there were. So the basic idea is that, look, California is a huge state. And so in fact, it's a state regulation, but it affects, tech firms throughout. And so, there's some counties that are not in the state of California, but they might have branches in California. And so they were sort of partially treated. And I wondered the extent to which, the authors can do even more. Like I was wondering, well, what happens if, how does this kind of partiality affect the firms? The other, I think, point that will probably come up with the reviewers is this idea of, what is the level at which analysis should be done, adoption is being done at the county level. And the authors do a good job of sort of justifying. There's other IS research that looks at innovation on the county level as opposed to firm level. And there's some issues with firm level data. There's some sparsity issues. And also sort of that sample would be biased towards bigger tech firms. But, you know, at the end of the day, especially as a marketing person, you know, we usually do analysis at the level at which it happens, and you basically have micro level data that you aggregate. The extent to which, you know, you lose some richness, and what else can you do to tell us a little bit more about firm adoption, right? Because the decision maker is the firm, and you have that data. You know exactly who is generating the patents and who is not. And you, of course, you would also have firm level controls, which also I think would be sort of, I would think of that as more of an opportunity rather than a critique, because you can maybe even get richer results with that. I really love the J-shape effect, that basically you see the dynamics of the effect. So you see a dip and then a rise. And, you know, Aaron did a really good job of saying, look, everybody looks at the linear effect, but it's actually, you know, a non-linear effect, which I thought was terrific. I also really appreciated the mechanism exploration. So just to kind of hype that up a little bit, they looked at calls, and they used BERT model to look at like what are people talking about in their communication, and use that to look at, you know, the mechanism, what are they, you know, what areas are people innovating in. I thought that was great, you know, and always, to me, the most interesting thing is the heart of the paper is often, of course, the result, but also the mechanism. And then, yeah, I mean, I think you guys have like a research agenda. You could probably write more papers on this. You know, again, it's I guess this law is the equivalent of the GDPR law in Europe. And so, you know, it's like 1,000 papers on that law. And I think there's probably, you know, more interesting papers that, you know, kind of a whole agenda that you can get out of this. And I totally agree that, again, I'm not an expert in this literature at all, but it sounds like yours may be the first paper that really has a clean identification for this law. And so it's less descriptive, and so, yeah, I think just kind of, yeah, just tightening, making maybe the writing a little bit more user-friendly, because it's such a cool topic. You know, you could write, the paper is written in a very scholarly way, we can kind of make it a little bit more, jazz it up a little bit, and then just, yeah, like, again, I think you're probably gonna get pushed depending on what journal on the identification, and just maybe trying something at the firm level. So, I don't know if there's time for questions or.
I think we're right at
Okay.
it, but if there's one burning question.
Yeah, maybe one question from the audience.
I don't know if this would at all, but I think it would be really interesting to look at the impact of making regulations on CCPA that come into effect. I mean, maybe it's like number 2, because those are really AI focused. I mean, those really touch on AI and require vertical sub notices and opt-outs for companies, and that might have an effect of influencing them a little more than the first draft of the regs and the law.
Good suggestion. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. On the next team.
I think yeah, send you a 15 minutes. I'll send you do you want a 2-minute warning or 3 warning? How much warning?
I'll keep track.
Yeah, okay. Perfect.
So-
Well, introduce yourself.
Sure. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So, first of all, thank Danny and Jennifer for having our paper here, for the opportunity to join the group and share the work, right? So, my name is Sean Chu. I'm an assistant professor from University of Notre Dame. Right. Today, I'm going to share one of the ongoing projects regarding the strategic behavior of consumers, right? How we battle against these pricing algorithms. Right. So that's one of the questions I had in my daily life, because we know nowadays companies, they have been using data and machine learning algorithm and even AI, right, to know who you are, to give you different tags, and then charge you different prices, right? And according to a recent study by FTC on surveillance pricing, it shows that all the companies, they have been using your personal data, location information, browsing history, right, to segment the consumers and then charge you different prices even for the same service or the same product, right? So when I booked the flight from Ohio, Chicago to Los Angeles, right, I realized that the more I search on Google Flights, the more expensive the price bill goes up, right? And on my daily life, like I'm not usually the person who places order for Starbucks, right? That's my wife who places order when we travel. Then we realized one day that I get more promotions in the app than my wife, right? You know, you took order 2 latte, you get 80 stars, right? These are the promotion, the personalized pricing we're talking about, right? Similarly, in hoteling industry and ride sharing industry, you can see similar patterns, right? These are the just anecdotal evidences, right? So it's not a rigorous, by the way, right? So I'm fascinated by the idea is there any way as consumers how we can battle or beat or fool the system, right? To get a lower price is possible, right? Clearly, like consumers here, we are not dumb, we are smart, we are brilliant. We want to challenge it, especially, you know, as a professor teaching innovation technologies, right? I guess I know enough about technology. I always want to find a way like to prove my data and then to manipulate the system so I can get some additional benefits, right? So I'm not alone. If you search on the internet, there are a lot of users sharing their experience. There are all kinds of ways and manipulate the data and you get additional benefits. For instance, people know that when you create a new account, right, you tend to receive more promotions, right? Or when you browse in a private mode, you can discourage company from tracing you and creating your digital profile, right? And sometimes by accident, I added an item to my shopping cart and forgot to check out, right? But then the next day, I got a promotion, right? So these are the evidences I collected in my daily life to realize that sometimes there's a way for consumer like to manipulate your data to fool the system or to manipulate the pricing algorithm, right? So that's the motivation. So in this study, we try to understand, to ask the following questions. So firstly, basically, what's the impact of this kind of strategic behavior by consumers? What's the impact on firm profit, their pricing schema? What's the impact on the consumer surplus, right? And the implications for policymakers, right? So in case I don't have time, just a preview of the key findings, right? So firstly, we found that with more strategic behavior in the market, right, it pushed companies less willing to use the so-called algorithmic pricing or personalized pricing, right? And if you talk to a machine learning scientist, a data scientist, they will tell you the better the algorithm will be more profitable for firm, right? But in our analysis, because of the existence, the presence of strategic consumer, it turns out that sometimes a perfect algorithm will not generate the highest profit for the company. And similarly, we usually would assume that if consumer becomes strategic, right, it's always a good thing for the consumer. It turns out that when there are too many strategic consumers, company will adjust their pricing strategy, right? It turns out that it may hurt the consumer as a whole group, right? Therefore, it's important for policymakers to fully understand the market structure before implementing any interventions. Right. So for sure, this is not first study on personalized pricing or consumer strategic behavior, right? There are tons of work about how to design the optimal algorithm, right? How humans interact with the algorithm, and more importantly, recently there's some discussion on algorithm collusions, right? Whether that will weaken the market competition and increase the cost. Right? However, this stream of literature kind of overlook the strategic response of the consumers, right? And there are some literature on studies on strategic response from consumers, mostly like similar idea, consumer can protect their data, right? They can manipulate their data. They can conduct additional search, right, to game the system, right? But most of the studies did not consider the interaction between algorithm and the consumer response. So that's what we try to address in this work, right? To answer this question, we build up a simple stylized model, right? Basically, we consider one firm in the market selling one product or service to a group of consumers, right? And for consumer heterogeneity, we consider there are two types of consumers. One group who have more willingness to pay, and the other segment of consumer who are low-type consumer who are not willing to pay a higher price, right? And company can use uniform pricing, charge them the same price, right, by serving one or two segments of consumers. Or the company can use algorithms, right, to predict your membership, your segments, right, and then charge high-type consumer, higher cost, higher price and low-type consumer a lower cost, a lower price, right? And because there's no algorithm that is perfect, right? So we introduce a parameter lambda here. And for simplicity, we kind of make sure the true positive, true negative rate are identical and false positive rate, false negative rate are the same, right? So that's some simplification we have to do in the model, right? All right, so let's take a look at the quick segmentation of consumers in the micro lens, right? For instance, let's say on the left, you see the consumer's true type, right? But the output of the algorithm will be just a binary label telling you whether this user is a high-type consumer or low willingness to pay consumer, right? So we know that for consumers who are classified as a low type, if I got a lower price, I have no incentive to conduct additional like strategic behavior, right? I will take the price and make the purchase, right? And for consumers who were low type but misclassified as high willingness to pay, right? So the best I can do is gaming the system and then pay a lower price I deserved at the beginning, right? So in that case, no one is willing to exert the additional cost. In that case, we assume the segment consumer will just leave and seek for alternative options, right? So that's why in the study we focus on consumers whose true type is high type and then who are classified correctly as high type consumer, because these consumers, they are motivated because once they are able to circumvent the algorithm, they can pay a lower price but enjoy the higher utility from pursuing the product. All right. So that's the segment of consumer we focus on in this work. So when consumers are classified as high type, we assume there are some consumers they are non-strategic, right? So either because they are not tech savvy or their time are too precious, so just go ahead and make the purchase, right? And the rest of strategic consumers, we assume they are always willing to imitate or pollute their data or manipulate their data, trying to get a lower price, right? So we assume their cost to game the system to fool the pricing algorithm, right? So which is another parameter theta here, which is heterogeneous among consumers. And more importantly, this cost of fooling the system or circumvent the algorithm increases with the pricing algorithm accuracy gamma here, right? So that's the consumers who can successfully circumvent the algorithm. But unfortunately, there will be some consumers who are not able to get a lower price, right? Among them, according to literature, some consumers will feel like perceived inequitably, will feel unfairly treated, right? So they will leave the market. And the rest, the remaining proportion, they will just purchase at the higher price, right? So that's how consumer decision plays out, right? So we consider a simple game sequence: firm choosing the pricing schema, either uniform pricing or personalized pricing, and then design the optimal price they charge. And the consumer follow the strategy we talked about. They will make their purchase decisions or circumvention decisions, right? So under uniform pricing, that's straightforward, right? The company either charge a lower price, serving the entire market with high-type consumer extracting additional surplus, or charging a higher price but focusing on only one consumer segment. Right. For algorithmic pricing or personalized pricing, the profit function is a little bit complicated because company will charge consumer differently based on the predicted label, right? For those predicted as low-type consumer, as we discussed, they will directly make the purchase and pay a lower price. However, for high-type consumers, right, some of them, they are able to circumvent the algorithm or fool the algorithm. We call them like successful imitators, right? They can manipulate the data and pretend to be low-type consumers, right? So instead of paying a high cost, they pay a low price, right? And among the rest, some of consumers will leave because of the fairness concerns, right? And the rest of consumers will generate a PH, the higher price revenue for the company, right? All right, so here are some interesting results from this study. So firstly, we found that actually with more strategic consumer in the market, right, company becomes less willing to adopt personalized pricing. So if you look at the bottom, right, so that's when the strategic consumer is 0, right? So we know when there is no strategic consumer, company either use uniform pricing or personalized pricing. But because usually we thought personalized pricing will dominate, but because the algorithm is not perfect, there's a chance the algorithm will make a mistake. So it's not dominating in that case when there's no strategic consumers, right? As the y-axis increases, you can tell that with more strategic behavior in the market, right, companies are less willing to adopt personalized pricing. Instead, they will just stick with the uniform pricing strategy. And secondly, it's an interesting result showing that as the algorithm accuracy increases, right, also most of the time, it can help the company enhance their profitability, right? But when there are too many strategic consumers, right, too many of the consumers, they will try to circumvent the algorithm, making the algorithm less effective, right? So in that case, the company's profit actually decrease when there are too many strategic behavior consumers as the accuracy increases. Here we summarize there are two competing effects. One is the algorithm enhancement or segmentation effect, because with a more accurate algorithm, the chance the algorithm make mistake will decrease, right? There will be less misclassified consumers, right? At the same time, when the algorithm accuracy increases, right, it's becoming more challenging to circumvent the algorithm. It's becoming more challenging to fool the system, right? So therefore, less high type consumer will be able to successfully get a lower price, right? So in total, in aggregation, we call them segmentation effect because of the algorithm does become more powerful, generating more revenue per firm, right? So at the same time, because there are strategic consumers who could not circumvent the algorithm, right? With more accurate algorithm, these consumers will feel frustrated, right? And then they decide to leave the market. So that's a negative effect. We call it the inequity attrition effect, right? So that's why we see a nonlinear pattern in the results, right? So that's the first insight we generated, right? At the same time, while working on the project last year, New York State actually implementing legislation requiring all companies who are conducting personalized pricing to disclose to the customers. Right. For instance, Uber Eats, right? They're using your location information to determine the delivery fee and the cost and everything, right? So our assumption is that when the law is passed, when more consumers become aware of the system, right? The market will be composed with more strategic consumers or strategic behaviors, right? So in what follows, we try to study what's the implications of more strategic consumers on the consumer surplus dimension, right? So I will skip the mathematical definition, but the results are kind of interesting. We can know that when the algorithm become more accurate, right, companies have more power to extract surplus from consumer side to the company side, right? So in that case, we know as accuracy increases, consumer surplus decreases, right? That's straightforward. However, with more strategic consumers, in general, right, overall consumer surplus will increase. But because company will respond, right, they will reduce their price to discourage such kind of circumvention behavior, right, and minimize consumers' chance of successfully circumventing the algorithm. Overall, it may lead to a decline in consumer surplus when there are too many of them, right? So that's kind of an interesting finding to us. And also, of course, we did some social welfare analysis, but in the interest of time, I will just simply skip that. All right, to summarize, overall, we find some kind of interesting results. So firstly, with more strategic behavior of consumers, right, companies become less willing to adopt personalized pricing. And surprisingly, higher accuracy algorithm does not always benefit the company. It totally depends on the market structure and composition of consumers. And thirdly, right, with more strategic behavior in the market, it sometimes may hurt consumers as a group. Right. So that therefore it's important for policymakers to understand the market composition before implementing any policies. All right, that's all I have. Thank you.
I just want to let you know that was unbelievable. The content, of course, but exactly 2 minutes.
All right, there you go. So I'm going to follow the law school folks in terms of no slides. But also I'll follow the law school folks in terms of giving tough love feedback, Sean. And you're my co-author, I'm going to do that.
You want to introduce yourself?
Oh, yes, and I'm Hemant Dandawal from UC Davis. I think John Matsuoka said this for empirical papers, that they're always wrong somewhere, because they're never totally right. And I think that's true for theoretical work. And there's a long-term saying, and it's been attributed to Saul Glass, but it could be somebody else, which is, most models are wrong, but some models are useful. Right? And so the question really is whether Sean got a model that provides useful enough, believable insights about this problem. And so the general, if I were to summarize what you're doing, is looking at this idea that algorithmic pricing is generally considered detrimental, but people ignore the fact that customers can also be strategic, and that's what you really evaluate. And first of all, I was skeptical about the whole idea, and then I read your introduction and examples and actually believe it. But one concern I have is that the evidence or anecdotes you provide about people are strategic. It's hard to tell whether they were being strategic or they were simply low valuation customers. And it's hard to believe that part of it in terms of story. And you might want to think about, does it really even matter to your model? Whether people are high value trying to mimic, or really they're just more low valuation customers in the market in terms of their observed behavior. And it's really like a revealed preference perspective rather than what they really are, which you don't know. Overall, I think I felt the paper was well written, and my test for that is, did I learn anything from reading past page 5? And I did not. In other words, the abstract introduction were so well specified in terms of what's coming in the paper that even though I did read the paper, it's really the first abstract, and then the first couple of pages really got me on this. So that's good feedback to you. All right. Then the next thing is the results. And it's fascinating. You had 4 results. You focused on 3 of them. And I'm going to give you exactly the opposite advice. So result number 1, which was that algorithmic pricing only helps under certain conditions. It's sort of a setup of the model. They're more strategic consumers and they behave more strategically. It's not going to help. I didn't find that result terribly useful. It's like, okay, it's an axiom of your setup. The second result was interesting, that firms may not benefit from more accurate algorithms. The third one I felt was misleading about the consumer surplus. And I think this is a criticism, not just of you, but the whole economics idea of focusing on consumer surplus as aggregate. It's not one. It's like you're taking I benefited, you lost more than I benefited. And then we summarize that by saying consumer surplus went down. And in this case, it's particularly misleading because you're saying that if somebody is a really good strategic consumer, they're going to benefit, but somebody else loses. And that's why I'm telling you that the aggregate is harmful. So I think that result has to be really placed in perspective and that careful nuance. But your fourth result, which you never talked about or barely talked about, the last bullet point here, is that policy in this setting is not one size fits all. You've got to figure out the details. You did not spend any time on that. You ran out of time. But I think that's really where I find that this paper can provide the most value. It does not yet, because you conclude by saying it needs to be, thought through and it's not one size fits all. But I think for me, the exciting work would be to explore that, get into more detail, and tell us what you have to do to get. Okay, so the other thing you pointed out is that not only should it be nuanced, but it depends on measurable factors that you can tell us how to measure. So tell us how we can take those measurable factors and create careful, nuanced, contingent policy, right? Is it even doable in the real world? Could we have that nuanced policy? I think that's the exploration which I feel would add most value to this paper. Whereas the first 3 results, I compress them a lot more and really get to this question. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions?
I do just have one question, and it's someone who is not clear at the paper, but a question about the slides. So looking at your confusion matrix that you presented, right, it appears you have like a proportional false positive, false negative rate. And just wondering, like, if the firm making the algorithm, right, it might make more sense for them to be more accurate. Like when you define algorithm accuracy, right, you're defining it as that's proportional. But if that changes, I'm curious how that might change the results. And I'm not sure if that was explored in the paper, obviously, but.
Great question, great question. Actually, for this paper, we have to simplify that to ensure attractability of the analysis, right? But in practice, I'm sure there are some kind of cost-aware, like machine learning metrics, right, that will add different penalty to different losses, right? So in that case, but here we assume identical, like two positive, two negative reads. But in practice, the weights could be different and the result might be different in that case. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, our next group, please. Okay, this is a super interesting paper, and I'm gonna hand it over to Aaron to present and tell us all about it.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Sure.
I mixed up
No
my.
problem. Thank you.
Sorry.
I'm Wei Bao from University of Connecticut, and thank you Jennifer and thank you Dawn for inviting me here. And it was super exciting session, and thank you very much to put me in and to talk about this work on the complementary and component data leak risk implications on comparative data protection investment. So this is ongoing work, and it was previously titled offensive events, comparative data protection investment data-based pricing. So this is a joint work with Yuxin at NYU Shanghai and Ping at Melbourne Business School. So this work was motivated by 3 patterns. So we are in a world that the variable, there's a growing need for the variable protections. And the first pattern is there's a growing public concern for privacy protection. Say for example, approximately 80%, 82% of the global population is under some kinds of protection of the national data security, and around 86% of general population identifies that privacy protection is a strong concern when they make their purchase decision. The second pattern is that there's still like persistent data breaches. Say, for example, there's like 5% growth in the publicly disclosed numbers of the breaches if we compare from the first half of the 2025 with the first half of 2024. And the third pattern is some firms decide or to choose to either to keep the investment in privacy protection at constant level or even reduce that level. Say, for example, nearly half of survey companies, they report a decline in the relative investment in protection, means that their investment in data protection increase at a lower rate than their sales growth. And in the extreme case, there are 40% of the firms, their chief information security office report there's like a budget cut for the security issues. Then these 3 patterns motivate the study by considering to understand and to reconcile the coexistence of the growing public concern for the data privacy. And there's a persistent data breach, and there's a decline in firms' investment in data protection. The way we choose is to consider firms' comparative incentives to invest in the data protection, where consumers face the breach risk, where the risk itself depends on their switching decision. And here's how we choose this way. So first, we consider there's a unique feature associated with data leaks. It is investing. So unlike typical data failures, where it happens when you consume them, data leaks will happen even the product is no longer purchased, it's no longer consumed. Typically, once the information is collected, consumers' personal data remains exposed to the leaks, regardless they stay with the firm or they switch. Then in competitive markets, consumers switch or they stay. So and when they switch, typically they need to provide a set of new personal information to the new firm. And when they stay, they may need to provide additional information to the firm during the subsequent interactions. And these two, the nature and the magnitude of information collected during the initial purchase and the subsequent purchase could be different. Then in competitive markets, and we think that then this may generate different incentives to firms to tailor their data protection. So specifically, when we conceptualize it, we call it a consumer, they switch and they entail the incremental data exposure. We call it a complementary data leak risk. And when they stay, then of course they may also incur incremental data exposure to the incumbent firm. Then we call it compounded data leak risk. Then given all this, then we think that maybe it's a good idea to study firms' incentive to invest in data protections through the lens of market competition. So that's why we considered, we use an analytical approach. We consider a stylized duopoly model that incorporate both complementary risk and compounding risk. Specifically, in the baseline scenario, we only focus on complementary risk. And this corresponds to the context where most of the personal information or sensitive data collected during the initial purchase. Or even there's like a subsequent data collection, those data entails much less privacy as compared to the initial data collection. And in the extended scenario, we consider both. So in that case, then both initial data collection during the initial purchase as well as the subsequent data collection during the repeat interaction, both means that consumer gives some privacy to the firm. So in a baseline scenario, so the first result we find is that there's an inverted relationship between firms' incentive to invest in data protection as well and consumers' privacy concern. The idea is that, so starting from the unique feature of the data leaks, so it's long lasting, then it means that if I stay, well, my information has been already collected by the incumbent firm, so that part is subject to some breach leaks. But even I switch, information is still there. So that part of information is still subject to the leak risk. But since I switch, I need to provide some additional information to the new firm, and that creates new exposure. So this leads to privacy-induced competitive asymmetry between the incumbent firm and the rival firm. And this asymmetry works against the rival firm in a segment. So it means that firms' incentive to improve the privacy protection or data protection is more on offensive motives to attract new customers. And these motives will have two impacts. The first one is, with a stronger privacy concern, then it's straightforward. So consumer values of data protection more, so this gives firms more incentive to produce, to invest more in data protection. However, it is due to this asymmetry. So it means that the rival firms need to offer some compensation to attract these new customers. And this compensation is low if the privacy concern is low. So in this case, adding a little bit more compensation as a result of the privacy concern growth is not too bad. But if the privacy concern is already very strong, so it means that firms already need to compensate a lot to attract new customers, so adding a little bit more could be devastating. So this just implies that the positive force that drives increased data protection investments linear, whereas the negative force is convex. So combining, then we have the inverted yield. So these results highlight the importance of the competitive asymmetry, as we will see below, and it has some interesting effects on the welfare implications. So when we look at the impacts of privacy concern on the firm's payoffs, then we first find that it has a one-time increasing impacts on the firm's profits if the firm has a larger customer base. But the effect becomes U-shaped if it has a smaller base. The intuition is as follows. A stronger privacy, as we just shown, that there are greater competitive asymmetry. Greater competitive asymmetry softens price competition. So this is good for both firms. However, this competitive asymmetry works against rival firm. In other words, it works in favor of incumbent firm. So if I have a lot of incumbent customer base, I benefit more. So in this case, two effects. The positive one, profit enhancing for reduced price competition, it benefits both firms, but the profit redistribution, it only benefits the firm with a larger customer base. So for the firm with large customer base, both are positive, so everything's good. But for the firm with smaller customer base, one positive, one negative, then we may expect some U-shaped thing. And I think the most interesting result that highlight the importance of competitive asymmetry is its impact on consumer welfare. The first part is intuitive because a higher consumer privacy concern means that consumers collect more. when they have privacy loss. And of course, it lead to a reduction in consumer surplus. But if we just measure consumer welfare net off those harms and disutilities from the privacy loss, we still can see that a stronger privacy concern lead to a reduction of consumer welfare of that measure, purely based on consumption value and price paid. This is exactly driven by the sovereign price competition stemming from the competitive asymmetry here. So this just like confirm or echoes the importance of the competition effect and seems to suggest that we are choosing the right approach to look at the firm's data investment decisions through the lens of competition. Then a natural question is, okay, it seems that it's all from the competitive asymmetry that drives, say, there's lower incentive to invest in data protection and the consumer's welfare goes down. Then a natural question is how to remedy this. Then here's the natural point to introduce compounded data leak risk. This risk kicks in because once we have that, by staying at the same firm, also increase incremental data exposure. Then combined with the long-lasting feature of the data leak risk, compounded risk also generate competitive asymmetry. But this asymmetry work against the incumbent, work in favor of the rival. So it means that when both are present or we introduce the compounded risk, it actually generated and competitive asymmetry that counterbalance the competitive asymmetry generated by the complementary risk. And if this counterbalance effect is strong enough, it can actually make the negative force that prevents the firms from increasing the data protection completely dominated by the positive force we identified in the first results. So that's why we have the result number 4, that we have a threshold for the compounded data risk level. When the compounded risk is lower than that, then we still have inverted yield, but it's greater than that due to the counterbalance things. The positive force always dominates the negative force. Then greater privacy concern always drive greater privacy, greater data investment. So these have policy implications that for the data minimization policies, which limits the firm's ability to collect data over time, then this could imply some unintended competition consequences because restricting the ability for firms to collect the data over time basically restrict the level of the compounding risk. Therefore weakens the competitive asymmetry that works as a counterbalance force here. So this could have some unintended welfare implications and competitive implications. So in summary, this work was intended to shed light on the observed coexistence of the growing public concern for the privacy protection and persistent data breaches, as well as the firm's decline in the data protection investment. And our competition-based mechanisms suggest that the data protections should be more focused on the strategic choice shaped by the market competition as well as the consumer switching behavior. And the comparison between the baseline scenarios and the extending one underscore the importance of accounting for how regulatory constraint on data accumulations shapes competitive incentives when evaluating the effects of such privacy regulations. So, thank you very much.
All right, thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss this paper. My name is Max Wei. I'm a faculty here at the USC Marshall, and we do have some just a few very simple slides that will help me discuss the paper. All right, so what's the context of this paper, right? The context of this paper basically is saying that we disclose information to companies, which creates privacy risks due to potential data breach later. So when you, for example, when you go to a hospital or when you get a new phone carrier, you have to provide a lot of information like your name, sometimes your address, credit card information, date of birth, all that kind of stuff. So if we look at that's the context of the paper. So if we look at the whole, like the message I get from the paper, so it uses the analytical setup. So consumer have privacy concerns, basically that is shown up as this utility from data breach. And there are two firms, so it's a competitive environment, and each firm tries to invest in data protection that it can mitigate data breach. Then we have consumers switching to another firm. It's going to incur additional privacy risk because when I switch to another firm, I have to provide a new set of information to a new firm, and the new firm may have a data breach in the future. So then that's the setup, right? So if we look at a key mechanism, basically higher consumer privacy concerns have two effects in this model. So if the consumer really doesn't like data breach, then first is for the firm, the benefit of data protection is going to increase. So because consumer doesn't like it, if I protect my data better, I can attract consumers. But there's a second effect, which is that there's the highest switching cost for the consumer, because as a consumer, I don't like to switch another firm because I have very high privacy concern, and I don't want to disclose a set of information to a new firm. And I'll come back to the mechanism later in the next slide. But with that mechanism, the key result, the key message I get from the paper, there are many, many nice results in the paper. The key result is that for me, is the firm's investment in data protection, it's not going to increase monotonically with consumer privacy concerns. So it's not like consumers worry a lot about privacy concerns, so firms going to increase data protection. It's not like that. The paper shows that it's actually inverted U kind of relation. So why is that, right? So as far as I understand, the mechanism is that basically in a model, there's connection between switching cost and the return of investment. And that's connected by the degree of privacy concern. So you have a kind of classical model of two firms competing, but the kind of trick here is that switching cost for the consumer is directly linked to the return of investment. So a higher switching cost, and the reason for that is because when I have a very high privacy concern, when consumer have very high privacy concern, that increase the return of investment, data protection, but at the same time, that means the consumer doesn't want to switch. So when you have that linkage, the model can produce an area of very interesting results, right? That's where everything, all the results are based on the linkage between those two key components. And that comes from the fact that a higher switching cost softens competition, and if the competition is lower, as a firm, I don't have to invest a lot in data protection. And you can think about two extreme cases. The first one is when there's no privacy concern, the consumer do not dislike data breach, so I don't have any need to invest in data protection, so the protection is zero. But the other extreme case is very high privacy concern. In that case, consumers do not switch anyways. Switching cost is super high, so as a firm, I do not need to invest in data protection either. So you have in the paper, you have this graph of inverted shape. So that's the summary, my read of the paper, and I think it's a very interesting and a possible tension, linkage between switching costs and ROI. And the tension allowed this paper to explain a very important, very interesting phenomenon where firms may divest in data protection when consumers really care about privacy. So that's a counterintuitive result that comes from this tension. And I think this tension is interesting and possible. And the paper is looking at that. Just a little bit common, I think it would be nice to see more motivation example for this tension, because this tension is so important in the paper. I feel like I want to see more examples which support this tension. And you can like in the beginning, I was a little bit suspicious. The more I think about it, I feel like this tension is actually there, but I feel like the paper can do this work for me instead of me thinking, okay, this tension is possible. And the current focus is where the switching consumer need to provide new information to a new firm, but in reality, firms often ask for the same information. So if I switch from T-Mobile to AT&T, they probably can ask me the same sort of information. Credit card, address, date of birth, stuff like that. So, but like I sent an email to the author, and actually in this case, the main result of people still hold, although the weaker form. I think that's like very nice in the sense that you can kind of focus on this scenario, the more likely scenario, to make the paper more broadly applicable. The last thing I just say that there's also, I think there's a right to be forgotten. So like you can go to the firm and say, when I leave the firm, I can ask the firm to delete my information. And in that case, I think some results going to break down, right? So, but I'm not saying this is kind of going to break the paper. I'm just saying this is nice to have this discussion in the paper and just to caution readers of this possibility. But overall, I really enjoy reading the paper, and I think that it's a good paper. And also, I'm pretty impressed by your presentation of a technical paper with no math or any technical formula. And I think that's very hard to do. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. This is Tessa Lin from Boston University. I am feeling very special today because I realize I'm actually sitting to two Chicago Post alumni. Very excited to get their comments as well. So with that, let me get right into the paper. So today I'm going to talk about choice architecture, and in particular, choice architecture deployment in the process of while companies seeking consent from the consumers to get their data. We're going to look at how that impact consumer welfare. So choice architecture, very familiar to every single one of us at this point. Every time we go to a new website, well, probably kind of more so in the Europe than in the US. When we go to a new website, they ask us, well, are you willing to share are you willing to allow us to kind of, insert a cookie so that we can actually profile you? Now, here is an example from Stack Overflow. What you can see is that, well, there are actually multiple design elements working together to maximize the chance that you're going to say yes. Number one, they hide the reject all button from the main screen. You would actually need to click the settings in order to make that decision. Second, they use different color schemes. Accept all is more salient. Lastly, they rank the accept all on top in order to further maximize the chance that a consumer is going to say yes. Design elements like this extremely prevalent. After GDPR, more than 50% of the websites in the Europe, when they deploy when they have cookie consent banners, more than 50% have some kind of design elements like this. In the UK, this number is even more prevalent. So the prevalence of these design patterns and their potential impact on consumers attract a lot of regulatory attention. It's increasingly an enforcement target. In this example, France actually fined Google and Facebook for pushing tracking cookies on users with choice architecture. Now, they don't call it choice architecture, they call it dark patterns. You may have questions at this point. So what exactly is dark patterns? Now, FTC's definition, which I believe is also the definition for other policymakers, is that, well, dark patterns means deceptive design practices that will harm consumers. Now, from a e-com and marketing perspective, this is a bit tricky to answer because, well, if you ask Richard Thaler, who invented the term nudge, he says, well, nudge can be either good to consumers or it can be a sludge, which could be bad to consumers. So ex ante, the welfare impact is actually not that clear. So we are going to tackle this question. What we want to ask first is that how influential are different choice architecture commonly deployed? How influential are they in shaping data sharing decisions? Are they all made the same? Are some of them working better than the others? And then we're going to ask, well, there are different policies that try to regulate choice architecture. How do they actually affect consumer welfare? To answer these questions, we are going to use a customized browser extension to randomize the banner choice architecture when consumers organically browse the internet. This is going to last for a week. We are going to measure the effect of this choice architecture on their data sharing decisions. So there are two features in this experiment that I want to mention. First of all, the fact that we are using a browser extension allows us to check how choice architecture works across different websites when consumers are organically browsing. This gains us some external validity compared to existing lab studies. It also gives us a broader set of websites and allow us to see whether choice architecture effects could actually depend on website characteristics. A second thing I want to mention is that our experiment has a control group that allows us to see what consumers would have chosen when they are not matched. So for our consumer welfare calculation, this is very important for us. It established our consumer preference benchmark for our welfare simulation. After the experiment is run, we are going to feed the data into a structural model. The goal of the model is to simply simulate different counterfactuals so that we can compare the welfare impact of different under different policy scenarios. All right, a simple experiment overview. The core of the experiment contains two different stages, what we call the survey stage and the organic stage. So the consumers come into our study. We first ask them to visit 20 different websites that we pre-specify. These will vary in domain popularity and also in website categories. And here, whenever they go to a new website, we are going to randomize the banner design. Then they are going to go into the organic browsing stage. This lasts for 7 days. We are going to randomize not just the design of the banner, but also the frequency of it. Consumer choices here are incentive compatible in the sense that we are going to enforce their decisions by passing their choices back to the website using our browser extension, and we tell the participants that we are enforcing their choices. Before and after this, we have an intake stage and the outtake stage. One thing I do want to mention is that in the outtake stage, we have an inline survey that asks consumers, why do you make certain decisions? What is your belief associated with certain decisions? Now, this will become important later on because one thing that we later observe is that it's possible for consumers to have incorrect belief about what a certain option leads to. So to the extent that we observe incorrect beliefs, we can actually take that into account in our consumer welfare calculation. All right, so 6 different treatments. This allows us to separate effects of 3 common choice architecture. And these are actually the 3 design elements that you saw from the first slide. Deliberate obstruction means that we are going to hide an option from the main screen. You can still choose it if you click into the settings. Second one, you can reorder different options to make some of them easier to collect than the others. Lastly, you can gray out certain option. For example, you can gray out the reject or if you don't want the consumers to choose them. I want to invite you to think of them as belonging to different categories. If you want to think about how obstruction changes consumer decisions, they mainly change decision by increasing the friction of the choice. On the other hand, reordering and graying out, they both change choices by manipulating visual salience. So these are very different mechanisms, and later you will see that, they actually affect decisions quite differently. This is our banner. This is our baseline design, where we remove all the deliberate nudges. So consumers go to this website, they see this banner, they can either click accept all, reject all, they can click into the settings. If they do that, they can choose to only share certain cookies and not the others. Lastly, there is a fourth option they can take. They can simply close out the window without making an explicit decision. So we will call it disengagement. Now, these 4 different options will always be available to them. It does not depend on what treatment design they are in. The main difference is how easy or how hard for them to make a certain decision. So for example, if we hide a reject or and hide that into the settings, they can still make the decision once they get to the settings. It's just harder for them. So this is deliberate obstruction. And then for the reordering, we are going to either run the accept all on top or the reject all on top. Lastly, for the graying out options, we are going to gray out both the reject all and the settings option. All right. With that, let me first talk about how consumers' data sharing decisions look like at baseline when they are not nudged. Without nudging, consumers will click accept all 60% of the time in the organic stage. During the survey stage, this number is a little bit higher, but both of these numbers are actually quite lower compared to existing lab studies. There are a lot of heterogeneity hidden under the 60% number. In particular, around 30% of the consumers will actually choose to change their privacy decisions across different websites. Another 55% will always accept all. 10% will always reject all. Again, this is their baseline preference when we are not nudging them. Among the people who do vary choices across websites, we see that these choices seem to be systematic. In particular, they are more likely to accept cookies if they are encountering websites that are familiar to them, that they have visited before, or if this is a website that is more popular, which means that, well, kind of the domain rank is lower. Now, how does the introduction of choice architecture shake things up? First, I'm going to show you the result of deliver obstruction. For clean comparison, I'm just going to show pair of treatments where visual salience treatments stay the same. And here I'm comparing reject settings with reject accept settings with accept reject settings. What you can see here is that no matter which option I hide, the choice for the hidden option will decrease by 70%. So this is a large change. And consumers are going to substitute towards most likely closing windows as opposed to kind of making more granular choices, which is what we would have hoped to see kind of beforehand. In comparison, visual salience manipulation, very small effects. Whether you're looking at the impact of reordering or the impact of graying options, they affect choice shares very little. All right, so far what we see here is that, well, choice frictions matter a big deal, even if it only involves an extra click. So what they may imply to well-being analysis is that, well, policies that change the choice frictions could have a big impact to consumers. So let's see how that it gets reflected in our policy analysis. Let's take a step back and think about the common policy proposals. So there are two common approaches when we are thinking about regulating choice architecture. The first one is what I would call as a design restriction approach. This involves first identifying what is quote unquote dark patterns, what kind of design harms consumers, and then bans them. This is what I would consider a whack-a-mole approach, because first you would need to identify which ones are harmful. And then because some companies are A/B testing things out, so it's actually relatively easy for them to find substitute design patterns that work equally well. In addition, they don't solve a common complaint among the consumers, which is that, well, there is decision fatigue. So there are a few issues with that. But the benefit is that, well, they give customization. They allow consumers to make very granular choices. A second approach is what is actually commonly known as global privacy control. Now, what that involves is allowing consumers to make one choice at the browser level that applies to all websites. Well, this is slightly different from the do not check proposal that was back in, I think, 2013, that is not actually supported, well, not actually backed by policy. Global privacy control is backed at least by a few state privacy laws. For example, if you look at California privacy law, they require companies to respect the global privacy control signals. Actually, there is a reason, as far as I understand, the recent Opt Me Out Act in California requires major browsers to actually implement this signal starting January 2027. So this is what California is doing. Now, EU is trying to do something similar now, but as soon as they kind of propose it, there is an immediate backlash. So let's see how these two types of policy proposals stack up with each other. I'm going to skip the structural model part. The only thing I want to mention is that, well, we do respect the fact that, well, there are different types of consumers and they have different preferences. And here we also see that, well, the preference estimates, well, actually match our raw data evidence quite well. We're going to take that model to simulate different types of counterfactual policies. In our paper, there are more of them, but for the short talk today, I'm just going to show you 4. There are 3 side-by-side consent policies, and they differ in what kind of choice architecture they allow, and whether they are using a pro-privacy or pro-data sharing default when a consumer closes the window. So the one that we consider as optimal for our participants within this category uses a banner that removes the deliberate nudges, but default consumers should accept all when they close the window. Why? Because baseline, they share their cookies with with companies 60% of the time. For browser level choice, it's simply allowing consumers to make one choice that applies to all the websites, and that's it. Again, I'm going to kind of speed through the surplus calculation. There are a few things I want to mention here because it's not a standard calculation. One, we actually do allow for the fact that consumers have incorrect beliefs. One thing that we see is that if you ask them, more than 60% of the consumers believe that closing consent windows means rejecting cookies. It's unfortunately untrue because they live in the US. If it would have been true if they are in the EU. So we take that into account using the Kenneth-Chan 2015 formula. The second feature here is that we need to account for the fact that removing choice frictions actually improves consumer welfare. So our current approach is that we translate the friction cost into the time spent. And then, we actually also translate the time spent into dollar values by calculating the dollar value of time using the hourly wage. Now, if you don't perfectly believe this calculation and think that, there is also in addition allowance cost, then what you're going to see in the next table is going to be a lower bound for the actual dollar value, dollar numbers. Okay, so punchline here. Global privacy control outperforms every side-by-side consent policies, whether they restrict certain choice architecture or not. And what you can also see here is that this is true even for the quote-unquote discerners, who are the people who would normally customize their choices when when you give them a chance to, when they are not nudged. So this table is basically saying the benefit of reducing the burden of repeated choice outweighs the benefit of being able to customize choices by website. One last thing I want to mention here, people often ask, how well your results generalize to EU consumers because our participants are from the US. We have a follow-up survey that actually shows that EU consumers prefer global privacy control more than our US sample, perhaps due to their experience interacting with the side-by-side banners. Okay, I'm done. I'm going to give the floor to Ella.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Bonka. I go by Ella. I am a professor of marketing at UCLA Anderson School of Management. And just like Tessari, I'm a Chicago Booth graduate. So it's my big honor and pleasure to discuss her paper here today. This is a very rich paper that she's had to squeeze into the 15 minutes presenting here today, just to give you a little bit of an idea of how much care went into putting this paper together and writing it up. She just quickly mentioned that they were using a cookie manager to run this field experiment. Well, they actually designed and developed that cookie manager just for this paper to run that field experiment. So there was a tremendous amount of work that went into really trying to have the exogenous variation to be able to manipulate people's privacy choices and to examine decisions carefully. So very rich paper, lots of descriptive results that we saw very quickly, and then lots of results related to saliency, related to obfuscation, to first choices, and related to choice architecture. I don't really want to talk a lot about kind of the technical details, but make a few comments more at the global level. So being from Chicago, choice architecture matters. I think this is one of the big takeaways from this paper. We know that from a lot of contexts, whether it comes to retirement choices, whether it comes to, you know, what we are buying in the grocery stores, how options are presented to consumers has a big effect on what people are buying. Even if you're going to the grocery store, if the same option is presented to you at the eye level versus at the top or at the bottom of the shelf, you are much more likely to buy it when it is conveniently located at the eye level. Similarly, there are saliency effects. If something is easy to find, if it is in a highlighted color, easy to find on the screen. Obama had a whole nudge unit that was working, trying to change the default options when it comes to retirement savings accounts and in other areas as well. So we have decades of research showing that the choice architecture of how options are presented to consumers matters. And it matters in the privacy context here, as Cesare was showing just as well. Especially what Cesare was showing was that default options matters. So that if what happens when consumers just click on that X sign, that they were having the wrong beliefs, that they thought that they were rejecting all cookies, but what instead was happening was that they were actually accepting all cookies. So there is confusion, the consumers have incorrect knowledge about what is happening in the area of privacy. So there is education necessary, so public policy questions, or there is some other, a better way necessary in order for consumers to actually be able to get the privacy outcomes that they would like to achieve. The system that is currently in place is not working out the way that it is supposed to work. And another clear message from the paper is also that any action that consumers have to take, and this might be not surprising for economists familiar with the consumer search literature, but any actions that consumers have to make are costly to them. It might only take a second to make a click. It might only, take a few moments to think about whether I wanted to accept or reject an option, but it takes some effort. It takes some thinking, and consumers have to make thousands and thousands of these decisions every day, and they get tired of it. They don't want to do that. And so they just try to find the quickest and the easiest way out. And so that explains why these global privacy options at the browser level perform the best, because there consumers only have to take actions once and not every time when they visit a new domain over and over and over again. So the costs to consumers are much lower in that case. Now, what does that mean? It means that if consumers have to make their privacy decisions for each domain separately, consumers incur significant costs to preserve their privacy. And costs are these effort costs, they are these time, they are these costs of clicking. Now, I am not a lawyer, so please, all lawyers, do not take the following words seriously, but do we really have a right to privacy then? Is it a right if we have to pay for it by having to click and having to exert efforts to preserve our privacy? And a normative question is then, should we have to do that? Now, that's not a question for me to answer, that's for the policymakers in the room, but it bears the question. To put it differently, I can flip it. In a way, privacy is not, in the world that we live today, privacy, we might not look at it as a right, but as a good that consumers have to buy. They pay for it. They pay for it through their effort, through their time, through their clicks. All these things have a monetary value associated for it. So you pay for it. And so privacy is a good, just like any other good. It has different characteristics, but it is a good. The point or the aspect that concerns me as an economist is that consumers are confused. They don't have full information about the good that they buy. They don't have complete information. So this is where the survey comes in that Tessari was running with her co-authors, in that they don't have the correct beliefs of what happens when they close the banner. They think they are rejecting all the cookies, but in fact, they are accepting them. So whole information, education comes in again. And that's all that I have. Thank you so much.
I'm just going to give you a couple of tips as a privacy lawyer that deals with this all the time. Just some clarifications that you should look at. So in the United States, we don't have opt-in. Our laws are opt-out.
Yes.
So cookie banners exist only because plaintiffs' lawyers have used wiretap litigation to threaten a lot of companies, because they say in order to place cookies on your site other than non-essential cookies, you have to provide consent. So that's a framework that's different. The global privacy control is only for opting out, which is what the US privacy laws are based on. Why this matters is the notion that by clicking X, your default, if a company is using a cookie banner for the purpose of mitigating the wiretap litigation risk, cookies cannot and should not drop until and unless consent is provided. Otherwise, there's no reason to have a banner. There's no reason to have a banner in the United States except for this litigation risk. Asterisk, health data, there's some other concerns. So I would just look into that. There's a lot written about, it's called CCPA, C-I-P-A for short, but I think you just want to make sure you have the right framework that you're talking about. That is very, very confusing. Okay, great. Well, now we're to the fun part.
Okay, good afternoon. It's a delight to be here, and thank you to Danny and Jennifer for having me. My name is Niall McMiniman. I'm with Compass Lexicon. I'm an economic expert. Today, I wanted to sort of draw the thread through all of these terrific papers. The thread is that these are really important papers, and I'm going to kind of explain why from my vantage point, which is in the expert realm, taking academic literature and kind of putting it to work, the application in a litigation matter. And I'm a U of Chicago grad as well, and kind of a very quick recent example. That is outside privacy, but I'm going to get right back, is just late last year, we, in a trial, had applied a field experiment, kind of like Tessari's, in a litigation setting. It was the first time it had happened. It's a methodology that's extremely simple. You draw a causal conclusion from these treatment and control cells, and Judge Boasberg, who ruled on the case and ruled in our favor, ruled on the basis of that experiment. Now, what that shows to me is kind of when this research bubbles up through this literature, through Tessari's work and others, it becomes part of, the basis for litigation. It becomes part of the basis for our laws, and it gets perpetuated, and that's important. And it's also, I see people here probably who use TikTok. I see a TikTok sticker on your computer. Just yesterday, TikTok gets to live. You know, it's no longer a national security threat because they're taking our data and giving it to the Chinese government. So, you know, now there's a US buyer who's taking TikTok. That's important. That privacy is important. Now let me take you into a couple of cases where I could apply, you know, the type of work that Tessari and others did. So in September last year, there was Google was a defendant in a case. It was a class action in California, the Northern District of California. Two big law firms. I'm working for one. And the case essentially is being argued. The idea is Google took data from this class of consumers without their consent. So, you know, that's a triable issue. Now, the question that we faced was, how do you determine from the consumer's perspective, how important is the data? And, you know, so you could apply some methodologies. One way to do that, to try to kind of tease out that value, would be to apply Tessari's framework. So, you know, you have a banner, and you can imagine just putting in front of consumers or users exactly the sort of consent framework you would need. So, you know, instead of sort of ill-gotten data, now you've disclosed. And you could measure kind of how do they change their behavior? Do they still consent to providing the data? And as Tessari found, you know, there's huge heterogeneity in how consumers react to, you know, their data, you know, and privacy. And I think that would be, I think, a really ideal application of that framework, that paper. And, you know, in that case, it wasn't just about let's make consumers whole. It was also about, you know, Google and Google's profits. So Google, you know, allegedly took the data and they trained their pricing algorithm. Essentially, they said, we want to target ads a little bit better. These data are going to help us do that. Right. So then you kind of get into Sean's paper on algorithmic pricing. You say, okay, let me use that framework to kind of assess how, you know, valuable to Google's profits is a personalized price, or a, you know, a targeted ad, or an ad load that really maximizes or optimizes for each person. Right. So that framework actually can tell you something about that. You know, there's frictions in there. There's strategic behavior. You're going to push back. They're not going to necessarily, you know, provide sort of this perfect price discrimination and take all the consumer surplus and put it into Google's profits. So now we're getting at a way of sort of thinking about, well, how much is Google profiting from these sort of incremental data? So I want to move on, and sort of in the realm of AI, sort of, you know, there's this case, maybe you've heard of it, Elon Musk is suing OpenAI. And essentially he's saying, you know, in OpenAI, you should remain a nonprofit, because by doing so, you will prioritize AI safety, essentially AI assurance and information going into AI. As a for-profit company, you can't do that. And, you know, I think you could apply, you know, I think Aaron's paper, where he's looking at evidence from the California Consumer Privacy Act, and he's saying with a definitive framework, how do these companies react when essentially regulated to, you know, to have privacy as an issue, right? So how do they behave? Do they innovate? Does it stifle innovation? And what he found is it actually doesn't stifle innovation. You know, you can innovate on AI assurance, so better safety, and you can innovate on frontier models and the data that go into those models. So the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So, you know, I could see that paper really kind of forming the basis for an argument in a litigation matter. And I think, you know, when going to Wenning Bao's paper and his co-authors, I think, you know, what's interesting there from an economist perspective is, you know, you start to see a marketplace, a competitive sort of process take place, where you have, you know, individual consumers who say are becoming more aware of data privacy, and they're saying, I'm going to switch. I'm going to take my, you know, my data, and I'm going to go to this other, you know, company. So I'm expanding my data exposure, but I'm doing that because I don't want to compound my data in this particular company that I don't trust. So, you know, there's sort of a reinforcing kind of competitive constraint on sort of AI or data regulation. And I think I found that to be fascinating. And, you know, I think all of these papers, you know, have their strengths and their development. And I think as I see them kind of bubble up when I'm working on my matters and others here are working on matters and I go to cite them, that sort of puts a lot of pressure on that paper to say, is that methodology airtight? Is the foundation all there? Because if it's not, this is an adversarial system and they'll go find the problem and expose it. And that's what they do to us. And they'll do the same to essentially the literature that we're citing. So but I congratulate all of these authors on really fantastic papers. I learned a tremendous amount and look forward to continuing to read about them.
You're here. Very good. Thank you.